1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Yes, it's fine now. Okay, so I will introduce yourself now.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone to this online course in the framework of our series of lectures on Introduction to International Relations at Alexandru Iancuza University in Iași. We discuss principles of international politics, including war, peace, and world order. And today we've got a very special guest with us. His name is Professor Dr. Stephan Stetter, who is the chair of international politics and conflict research at the Bundeswehr Universität München. And he will today talk to us about enemies and allies, about how these groups of enemies and allies form in different international conflict contexts, from Ukraine and the Middle East, South China Sea, including perhaps Congo. Thank you very much for being with us today, Stephan. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Diego. I'm really pleased being with you here today. We know each other for a long time. We have studied together, and I'm really delighted seeing you here, and thanks for organizing this. And I'm also glad, only virtually, but it might change in the future, being in the old Romanian capital. So that's also very nice, and best regards to all students and colleagues in Iași.
Yes, we've got today with us many students watching. Today is a holiday in Romania, but we have still many students watching this lecture today. And let's start with that. Let's start with our universities. Let's start introducing our universities. So you come from the Bundeswehr Universität München. Could you tell us a little bit about that and about what you do in this university?
Yes, that's with pleasure. I'm sitting here in my office at the University of the Bundeswehr Munich, Universität der Bundeswehr München, which is the University of the German Armed Forces. I'm sitting here in my office in the south of Munich, on the highway to Salzburg. It's snowing at the moment, so winter has come here. I can see, not today, but usually I can see from my office the mountain ridge of the Alps. So I'm really close to this. Munich has 3 universities, and one of them is the University of the Bundeswehr Munich. I'm here since 2008. I'm at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Affairs. We are very interdisciplinary, which is fantastic, because our students learn to study international affairs from different angles: economics, politics, sociology, ethics, law, history, but also for me, because in my academic career, I'm here since 2008. I think you have to try to be open as an academic and develop, and a lot of influences come from my colleagues. One big influence is that I work closely with colleagues from international law. And once a year, we organize a study trip to an interesting part of the world with 15 or 20 of our master's students. We have been this year to Jordan. Next year, we go to Kenya. We've been to Cyprus, Greece, Israel, Palestine, Georgia, Armenia, Spain, Morocco, to different places. And I profit a lot from this interdisciplinary angle, international law. So what I'm doing here is to do my research. I'm a normal academic, so my university, although it's part of the armed forces, is a civil university. I'm not a military, I'm a normal academic. I studied with Diego in London and got my master degree and my PhD there. And my academic life is the life of a normal academic, writing, going to conferences and interacting. My research topics are theories of international relations, in particular in relation to conflicts, war and peace, and politics and society in the Middle East, which certainly is a hotspot, again, at the moment. And also I do work on EU foreign politics. And that's my research. It's free, as I said. I'm a normal academic. can do and research what my academic interest is. And I can also teach this. So we have a study program here in international law and international politics. I just come from a lecture on power and authority in international relations. I just did this lecture for a master course this morning. And that's what distinguishes my university. Legally, it's one of the 2 federal universities in Germany. The other universities are not German universities, but belong to the German states. So the universities are not federal, but state-based. And the second difference is my university is federal, one of 2. And the second difference is that all my students are officers of the German army. So if you want to become an officer in the German army, you have to have a normal civil university degree. And we offer this degree here. So the students study a normal study program. They don't study security politics or foreign policy analysis. They study social sciences and public affairs from a very broad perspective, a normal university degree, and they need it in order to have the officer career in the army. And they are all graduate from high school, basically. They are between 20 and 25. So that's what is specific about my university.
Okay, so you mentioned that you've got a regular civil curriculum for yourself. Even I saw your biography online. You even mentioned that you did your civil service before university, and now you teach in this university that is specific for the armed forces of the German state. You also mentioned that you, as an academic, are interested in openness and in relations with other institutions, and that you even organize trips for your students to visit interesting places in other countries. My question is now about other kinds of exchanges, such as Erasmus exchanges, semester-long exchanges. Do you also organize that, or would you be open to organize something like that? Because I believe that since your university is relatively small and specialized, but because your field of studies is very international, right? Your own field of studies, international politics is, but also the interest of the university, the armed services is also international by nature, right? And my question, if you would be open to consider the possibility of an Erasmus agreement with the first University of Romania, with the University of Iași.
Yes, definitely. And this is a policy of my university, but it's also an agenda which I consider important. So we have several of these agreements. When I said that the students here are all officers of the German army, I generalized. There are some exceptions to this, but there are some people from Germany, but that's not interesting. But we have international students who come here. Because we are a civil university, we can, and we do have Erasmus agreements with other European / neighborhood countries, and that's very important to us in terms of outgoing. So the students at my faculty, they are enthusiasts in being outgoing students. So at the outgoing phase during the master program, they usually find a slot of 3 months, 6 months, and they love to go to another university and stay and study there. So that's very popular. I think in my faculty master degree, 50, 60, 65% of students take such a leave at another university. And we're also interested in incoming students. Now, I have to say that most of our courses are in German. I know that many people in Romania speak German, and that might be an opportunity for some. The bulk of our study program is in German, but of course, that's always in Erasmus programs important to have English language courses as well. And we're also increasing the portfolio in English language seminars. So for example, next term, we have 3 trimesters here a bit like the English system. So for the term January to March, I will teach a course on current debates in peace and conflict studies and IR. I will discuss some key articles and texts, which I think are landmark texts with students, and this course is held in English. So it's possible to pick English language courses here, but the range is more limited because the bulk of courses is in German, but both is definitely possible.
Yes, we also have German-speaking students. In fact, meine Lieblingsstudentin ist aus der Schweiz. Patricia Jäger is her name. Yes. And she was one of the most interested ones in this lecture that you will hold today. But we also have other students like George Hrechenyuk, who also, I think his surname is of Ukrainian origin, but he's Romanian, and he speaks German perfectly. So the German language wouldn't be a difficulty, right? Okay, so the topic today that you will discuss is about enemies and allies, right? But I am a bit curious about today's topic because you presented this topic to me as something general about how these enemies and allies are aligned in different international conflicts. And you mentioned many different ones in Ukraine, in Palestine, in South China Sea, even in Congo. But my question is, when you thought about this lecture, did you think about some specific conflict nowadays where even though your theory is a general one that will apply to many conflicts in a comparative perspective, right? But were you thinking what drove you to this topic? What was the concrete issue that drew your attention to this topic?
Of course, it's a long-lasting interest of mine studying conflicts in international relations, and not just conflicts about climate-related carbon emission targets, which is also a conflict, an economic one, but I'm interested in particular in violent conflicts and security-related conflicts, and also ways to address them. And we call this way of addressing them international community. We often say the international community should do this and that, and this is an idea maybe about some actors, but also that there is this normative umbrella, or we call it a peace process. So that is something I'm interested in. I'm interested in for a long time. From an international relations perspective, I think it's interesting to ask what is the global context within which conflicts play out. And there's one current answer to your question, and this is that we see conflicts coming up. Russia's war against Ukraine last year, which definitely it's a Russian war because it's related to a specific understanding of Russian foreign policy and power projection in its neighborhood. So this is related to foreign policy thinking in Moscow. It's related to a regional dimension, obviously, because Russia conceives of regional politics as its sphere of influence, but it's also global. And this has, I think, become increasingly visible that Russia is demanding something about the transformation of the international order. They want to have it different. And I think, if I may add this point, that one of the most disappointing things for Putin in this war so far is that the Americans are not talking to him. So I think it's like getting attention from an ex-partner. Hey, I'm invading Ukraine. Now I want to talk on eye level with the US president. And Biden has rejected that from the very beginning and has left it to China to make to talk with Russia. And what the US is doing is talking with China when Xi Jinping came to San Francisco last week. So we see that this transformation of international politics is very dynamic. We don't know how the China-US relationship will play out. But definitely the war in Ukraine is embedded in this global setting. And we could say this now about every conflict that comes up. Some of them, of course, are more regional, but in terms of the political dynamics, you mentioned the Congo. Congo is sometimes referred to as the first African World War, because basically countries from all over Africa are actively involved in fighting in this conflict. And in terms of refugees, the conflict has even a global dimension, at least reaching Europe and the Middle East. So that's more regional, but there is a global dimension to it. Also because every conflict, or almost every conflict that reaches a certain level of violence, reaches the United Nations. It's debated and discussed there and compared to other conflicts.
Our students are saying that they're very interested in this topic that you are discussing now about Ukraine. I understand that probably because it's a very close conflict to Romania. And for instance, Anna Maria Lazar, you can see her on the chat there. She's writing that she would like to know more about the geopolitical landscape in Ukraine, about those alliances and tensions in this particular region.
I will answer that in a moment, but if you see the subtitle, we have Ukraine, we now have the Middle East, and that's a long-standing local conflict. It's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which celebrates 100 years now of intense conflict, including violence, that started in the 1920s, that we have episodes of violence. It's regional because it's related to relations between Israel or the pre-state Jewish organization and Arab states in the region, but it's also global. And when that started, when Hamas attacked Israel on 7 October, many talked about, did Tehran know about it? Did they orchestrate it or support it in some way? And what does it help Russia? Actually, that attention is diverted from the Ukraine setting. Or is Russia actively involved because they are now aligned with Iran because Russia is isolated? I read that Lavrov now came to North Macedonia, but otherwise Russia is very isolated in former relations, economic and political, it had with the West. And it turns to other partners like Iran. And they're all interested not just in regional transformations. Russia wants to have its sphere of influence. It doesn't want the European Union to have these states as members or the Americans to enlarge the security umbrella of the United States to Georgia or to Moldova or Ukraine. That's regional, and Iran also has a regional agenda, but they're all interested, and that is the point. And now we can also look to the South China Sea, that all these actors say that they are interested in a global transformation. They consider the international system as unjust, too much power is with the United States, and they want to transform it by peaceful or non so peaceful means. I don't think these actors want to start a world war, but they do this kind of Cold War constellation of hurting the West where it hurts in different places without passing beyond a certain threshold. So that's the constellation. That's why we have to see all these conflicts. We have to look at them, each one for itself, but also in this global context. And now you mention alliances. I think it's important to see that these alliances are relatively weak until now. So there's a shared interest between China, Iran, Russia, and others of making a transformation, but it's not a solid and firm alliance because their main interests are still regional. So Hamas or Iran, they want to transform the international system as a whole, but their main interest, and I would also say their main capacities, are on the regional level, in the conflicts they are directly engaged in. So what we are witnessing now are, well, interesting times, so to speak, because the question is, can these isolated conflicts where we see some elements of a global agenda, which in its extreme version would lead to a new Cold War constellation with two blocs. Is this consolidating or not? I think this is still an open question, but we see some elements of that. The worst, of course, would be a third world war, but we can also talk about this. I don't consider this the likeliest version. I think the extreme version would be a world divided into blocks, but that's a very dangerous way to go, I think, in particular for some actors in the global south or of emerging powers, in particular China, because the disruption of connections they have with the West, economically speaking, I think would hurt them very much. So they are very nationalist under Xi Jinping, but I don't think they have made the decision yet. And of course, China is very essential in all that.
Yes, I think it was today they published the growth data for the United States, and it was 5.2% in the last quarter, and it overcome sometimes the growth of China in some quarters. So it seems that nowadays, on economic terms, China is suffering from the current tensions with the United States. So you believe this will lead to a cold war? You said that's the most likely scenario, or still there can be a pacification, like to do business as usual?
Well, I would consider a light version of the Cold War the most likeliest scenario. A light version means it's not a hyper weaponized relationship with a lot of threats. Maybe not even an arms race, in particular a nuclear one, although this cannot be excluded if we look at Iran and what this could trigger in Saudi Arabia and other places. But I don't see this also because China is too far away from both Russia and the United States in terms of nuclear weapons. So China will not engage in a nuclear arms race. We also see some limitations, I think, to Chinese military power. The Chinese army is not trained and tested as an offensive force. It's difficult to assess how this will affect their military strategy, but definitely they are not as experienced as, of course, the United States, also Russia. We also see some limitations to influence in the Middle East now to Russian and Chinese power. The main actors involved there in brokering what is happening are the United States and Arab countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia in the background, Egypt, and others. And it's very hard for China and Russia to get a foothold now. Of course, Russia is in Syria actively involved and is doing a lot of damage there too, as in other places too, but it's this disruption. And it's this policy of disruption in different places that I would see as the most likeliest scenario, as long as these governments continue. So we talk a lot about the crisis of liberalism and of liberal regimes. And if we look at the election results in the Netherlands, maybe the United States next year. So that's a complex and difficult situation. But of course, the authoritarian states, they are not as stable as they project themselves, and we shouldn't take them like that. So in Iran, we have seen many grassroots protests, and the economic situation in Iran is dire. You just mentioned the economic situation in China, which partly has to do with wrong foreign policy decisions during the pandemic in particular as well by China. So the sanctions are difficult for Russia, and Britain announced that the number of foreign soldiers is massive in Russia. So it's difficult to assess the quality of these figures that we hear. But I just want to say that all this only works under the equation that all these systems are stable. And I think they are not. They have to invest huge resources in ensuring stability domestically. So that is something that we also have to consider in this debate.
You mentioned that nowadays conflicts are regional in scope. There's important conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, and in the Middle East and South China Sea, but there are still regional, but they are somehow interrelated. This interrelation, does it mean that there can be a degree of coordination? For instance, in the case of Iran, you mentioned that the conflict in the Middle East, it's a regional conflict, and Iran has its own interests in the region, but sometimes they can be aligned with those of Russia if this conflict can draw resources that previously were being used in the war in Ukraine. Or do you think that there is scope for coordination among the enemies of the United States?
Yeah, I think there's scope for coordination of actors that seek an alternative agenda, let's put it like this, who want to transform the global system or the regional system. In the Middle East, this is very obvious in an alliance that Iran has with several non-state actors, like the Hezbollah in particular, also the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas to some extent too. The Hamas-Iran relationship is more fragile, which has to do with ideological reasons. It's the Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement. It's Sunni, and Iran is Shia. So they have a convergence of interest, and maybe for a Westerner, this is political Islam, but there's a split between Shia and Sunni, and there has also been a power policy split between Iran and Hamas when the uprising in the Arab countries took place, because Hamas was against Assad and was in favor of the protest movement in Syria, as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which shortly was in power in Egypt. And Iran was very dissatisfied with Hamas back then. And then Hamas changed course and became an ally, but more in power political terms. But there's this regional alliance building definitely between state and non-state actors. And we also see this on the level of disinformation. If you look to the cyberspace, that's part of the Russian foreign policy strategy in particular, to have disinformation. So Russia does not have groups with weapons in different Western countries, but it tries to exert influence through a policy of disinformation. Definitely, that's part of the foreign policy strategy, not just of Putin. It has a long history in Russian foreign policy that dates back to the 19th century. If we look at that, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is an anti-Semitic, very powerful pamphlet, was produced by the Russian Secret Service in Tsarist Russia. So that's playing with this information. And they are entangled, these conflict arenas, definitely, because this policy of disruption is not just regional, it's something that certainly has a global dimension. There's also a global response to it. One of the global responses is a comeback of the United States in many arenas, because many actors in these different regional settings consider the United States completely essential in order to maintain not just the status quo of political relations, but keeping it peaceful and conflicts not escalating. So that's very clear for the European countries and NATO. The presence of the United States is completely essential for European security in the perception of most European policymakers. It's very clear in the Middle East, where there was this pivot Asia argument that the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East. And we see now the United States is back massively, because both Israel and Arab countries require the presence of the United States. And it's happening in the South China Sea, where countries like from Japan to South Korea to Australia to Vietnam to the Philippines have soft or hard security assurances from the United States. Taiwan, of course, too. So the presence of the United States is not just element of US foreign policy thinking, which also has a very strong imperial dimension, no question about this, but it's very much demanded in different regional settings. And this is an element of this global interaction. What we see, how is this functioning? it functions very much in form of deterrence. I think deterrence is the main foreign policy tool that we are seeing in these different arenas right now. It's a deterrence towards China of not invading Taiwan and keeping the South China Sea relatively peaceful, not requiring too much territory or amassing new islands there and attacking fishing boats from the Philippines. We see it, if I may just add this, we see this deterrence in the Middle East with US aircraft carriers close to Iran and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we see it in Europe. And since we are all interested in Ukraine so much, I think, and it's not outspoken, that one of the main decisions made by the US and also made, I think, by European governments is not really that Ukraine wins this war, is that Russia is stuck in Ukraine. And that's also a form of deterrence. It's very difficult for Ukraine in terms of the human toll. This requires, it's not spoken so openly about it, but I think the consideration in Washington is that all these conflicts are very dangerous if they escalate, and deterrence is better than escalation. And deterrence means keeping the conflicts isolated. And this is what the EU is doing, what the US is doing in Ukraine. It's what it is doing in Israel and Palestine, to keep it isolated in this territory, not spreading geographically, and trying to maintain it there, and maybe reaching a stalemate, a ceasefire, and some provisional agreements. And if the larger picture is there, maybe at some point a political process in all of these arenas.
We've got 2 questions now from the public. There are 40 old students that are connected, and they are all the time writing on the chat. One question is by Roberta Neagu, and she asks about the accession of Ukraine to the EU, the eventual accession of Ukraine. How would it affect the international system?
Yes, Roberta, thanks for this. I think this is a tremendously important process. It's very important for Ukraine itself, because in order to endure this war, I think this post-war perspective is extremely important. We also talk about this in other settings. I also think it's important for the Palestinians to have a perspective of reaching self-determination, national self-determination. It's very important for Israel to have a perspective of being integrated in the region. So you need a post-war perspective. And in Ukraine, Russia, I think it's very difficult, because my reading of this conflict is that there's a clear aggressor in this case, unprovoked. But from a Russian perspective, I don't talk about Russians, I talk about the foreign policy elites. This was a reaction to an interference in what they conceive as their sphere of influence. That's how they read their post-Soviet neighborhood, and maybe also some places beyond. But I think this perspective of the EU is very important for Ukraine in order to endure in this conflict. That's very essential. It's very important also pacifying. We know that EU enlargement has a very important role and I think the European Union is an extremely important project for a prosperous and peaceful Europe. That's what policymakers talk about. It sounds like a bit like a slogan, but I also think it's sound from an academic perspective to see it like that. It's a big carrot for domestic transform. So how should we know that? That's the huge influence the European Union has on transformation of societies, which makes them not just economically more viable, but probably also more peaceful, less corrupt, is this membership perspective. So I think that's also important. That's also important from this perspective. And in Europe, it's also essential, because if Ukraine wouldn't be a membership candidate, solidarity would be much, much weaker. So I think it's important that in Brussels and capitals, this process is continued with Ukraine. The important issue will be that Russia, in one way or the other, accepts this independent choice of Ukraine. Of course, this is the open issue, and it started in 2014 in the Maidan revolution. This was about the European perspective. It wasn't even about NATO that we had the first big escalation steered by Russia there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so essentially, if I understood right, the accession of Ukraine is very important in this conflict because it gives hope to Ukraine for what will come after the war, right?
So there are different perspectives. Also, I think a very dangerous situation would be, let's imagine that. I use some geopolitical vocabulary now. I'm not working in a geopolitical frame because often this is the wrong way of thinking about international politics. It's not a chess game. But let's consider a situation in which Russia is not able to conquer Ukraine. And I don't think they will, because they maintain the territory they have conquered in the Donbass and on the Crimean Peninsula. They fortified that immensely. They can keep it with immense cost. So let's say they are not able to conquer the rest of this big country that Kiev is. And of course, if they would start now approaching towards Kiev, that would provoke, again, weapon delivery, another reaction in the West as well. But Ukraine that is a Ukraine that is not part of an alliance and remains outside of the box. I don't think this is a good scenario for European security, long-term speaking. So I think it's very important to integrate a big and important country like Ukraine and not have this buffer zone. So that was the geopolitical word that I wanted to drop. I don't think having a buffer zone between the European Union and Russia would be helpful, because this would be a constellation in which either permanent conflicts would be triggered in this buffer zone, or that this buffer zone country is not part of any economic and security architecture. And I think it's very important that in order to have a shared security approach, to be part of an alliance, an economic, a cultural, a political like the European Union, and a security-related one like NATO. So I think that's why this perspective is important.
Okay, Nicole Prikop also asks one question about the current conflicts, the different conflicts that you mentioned currently in the world, whether you think that violence is necessary, or there's a possible diplomatic solution to these conflicts.
Both. Nicola, it was, right? Nicole. Both, because we shouldn't think of violence and diplomacy as unrelated. In reality, they are linked to each other, and states threaten with violence or actively engage in violence, and they pursue diplomacy at the same time, and non-state groups too, also historically. If you look at the PLO, for example, I think the PLO is a very interesting example of a non-state organization. They aspire a state, but in the 1960s and 70s, they had this double strategy of being a guerrilla group on the one hand and a diplomatic actor on the other. So I think in reality, it's related. And we know from conflict studies that conflict parties often seek violence in order to turn their conflict global, to get the global attention. In the West, in non-Western societies, from political leaders, from the United Nations. So violence actually is a mechanism in order to get attention. So that is I think what we see here. We see also that diplomacy never stops. I think one of the big miscalculations in the war in Ukraine was, it's completely right to study this war in terms of what is the foreign policy thinking in Russia and the Kremlin. What is the ideology, the imperial, that drives Russia? It's also good to read the Twitter or X post of Dmitry Medvedev and him threatening with global nuclear war. And this debate, as you might know, was very strongly perceived in Germany, which has a kind of, there are several national traumas in Germany, but one of them is the Cold War, the country being divided and Germany being the battleground of a nuclear war between the two superpowers. So this was taken at face value, what Medvedev and Russia were saying there. And there was a lot of fear about, I think more than in other European countries, about how much can we support Ukraine, because Russia will go nuts and just start a nuclear war. And when I participated in this debate last year, I said, okay, it might happen, I don't know, but I think it's unlikely as an international relations scholar, because what you underestimate when you say this is the extent to which we have an international political system with its own rules, which Russia has to consider. And this includes the Chinese reaction to threats with nuclear weapons. Beijing doesn't like it, and I think they told Russia very clearly. So Russia also kind of stopped doing this. But Russia has a political agenda. They don't want the Third World War and then everything is over. They have political objectives. And in order to reach them, they need diplomacy. So there's the conflict extends to the diplomatic realm. And we see many of this. The sanctions, Putin being investigated by the International Criminal Court, which massively limits his ability to travel. We see that this conflict started a completely new wave of diplomacy, as I just elaborated, with bringing the United States more into European, but also Middle Eastern and South Asian security and diplomacy parameters. So I don't think it's a contradiction. The violence very often triggers diplomacy, and this is what we see at the moment. The second part of your question is, will we see and when a peaceful settlement of all these conflicts and a solution to these conflicts which is widely accepted? I think this is a long-term question that you're asking, because I don't see this as a moment at the moment in these arenas. But as I said before, I see deterrence. And I also don't see a massive escalation. That's a hypothesis. Okay, but that's my answer to this question.
Okay, the questions are piling up. This is a very good thing. We've got a pile up of questions now. And by the way, today is Nicole's birthday. So you could wish her happy birthday.
Yeah, happy birthday.
And we have another question by Esmeralda Gabriela Miron. She asks about the conflict in Kosovo and Serbia, right? I know you've been there recently. Could you tell us how do you think this conflict will affect the stability of the region?
I think it was warned by Prime Minister of North Macedonia that there could be this domino effect in southeastern Europe. That's possible, and if we have a very fragile security situation, not just in Kosovo, that escalated in September when this event happened at a police station in northern Kosovo by Serb strongman, militiaman, who has some connection also to President Vučić and his party. Serbia so far, I think, has maintained this policy of independence because Russia is interfering there too in Southeast Europe, and this danger of escalation might be there because this could spill over in particular to Bosnia and Herzegovina, which has a very complex conflict solution institutional setting. It could spill over, but it depends on what Serbia is doing. And I've been to Belgrade a few weeks ago, as Diego just said, and my reading is that 70% of Vučić wants to maintain this balance at the moment because he also has to play to, and also maybe I also think he believes in this Serb nationalist idea, and also a strained relation with the West, which has to do with the West's interference in the Kosovo War, bombardment of Belgrade, etc. But he doesn't want to choose side with Russia. That's also important. It's maintaining a policy of independence. And this also means, and I think Serbia is very essential here, I don't see them escalating all these conflicts. And also this recent episode was kept under the carpet, or quickly the fire was turned off by Vučić as well. So I don't see this escalating. The difficult situation is of opening up the rest of Southeast Europe to the European Union. And personally, if you ask me, I would like to see a more active and engaging European Union in that context of really defining a process that brings all these countries within the European Union more actively than we see this at the moment.
We've got another question by Joanna Olariu. It concerns Ukraine. It mentions that she believes that Russia does not have an interest in conquering the whole of Ukraine, but it already controls the Donbass and the Crimean Peninsula. And the question is about the future, about the future peace, the future settlement of this conflict. If you think that Ukraine will ever retake those territories again?
I don't know. It's in the future. I'm skeptical that this is gonna happen. But what does it mean? I'm skeptical. It means that what we see in the Donbass and in Crimea is occupation under international law. It's a Russian occupation. And we know from other settings too, we mentioned the Palestinian territories here. We could also refer to Western Sahara and other scenarios that occupation, we can talk about North Cyprus and the role Turkey plays there. It's a bit of a different case. But these occupations exist and they can continue for decades without the status changing. So that is what I would see here as a possible scenario for Ukraine, that it's impossible to get Russia out of these, or Transnistria, we could also talk about different places, it's impossible for Ukraine to drive Russia out of these territories, but that this is not accepted by the international community. And this is a stabilizing factor that we have also seen at the beginning of the Ukraine war, why so many countries worldwide have rejected the Russian invasion, because that's very threatening to the whole international state-based order. If a state can come and just go into another state and try to conquer it. I see this because we are all humans, and humans have a hard time accepting conflicts. Conflicts is something we want to solve in our private life, in most other settings too. And we have very often this expectation in political conflicts. And I work a lot for 30 years on Israel and Palestine. And there's so much hope in peace, which is very good. But we also have to see that many conflicts just endure. And we always talk about how can we solve them, whereas the reality is that they don't stop. So the question also is, how can conflicts be maintained and kept at a level that is not escalating regionally, and that is very important, ensures security for people on the ground. So if we have a situation in which people are deprived of food or of jobs, that's also not acceptable, of course.
Your lecture's been very successful. We've got another question by... we are lagging behind a little bit with question, which is a good thing in a sense. By Andrea Damian, she asks about the Prime Minister of Hungary and his influence on the EU, and what do you think? How do you think that affects the EU security and its relations with Russia?
It affects it negatively. I'm grateful for all these questions. I'm fearing that a question on Myanmar, Burkina Faso comes up. So I'm not a specialist on every single country on this globe, although I do international relations and I read about them. But also maybe that's the academic speaking. I think if you're deeply engaged with something, it's also important to travel there know language and do all this stuff, and that's of course, so I don't speak Hungarian. But of course I follow this closely, and I think what we see here, it's very problematic what is happening domestically in Hungary. That's also a domestic issue for the European Union, because it relates to rule of law and democracy, and the EU has some means at its disposal to force member states to do something, and the EU is very cautious in doing this, which is also a problem. But the EU has to be cautious in doing this, because we see that there are many centrifugal tendencies in the European Union as well. Nobody wants the EU to explode. So that makes it very difficult and plays in the hand of Orban in this case, because he knows this, and he can make active use of this. In terms of Russia, this is negative, because he's a veto player, not just here, but also in terms of the membership of Sweden in NATO. So this is now somewhere in the Turkish parliament for a few weeks now. Maybe they don't know in which room the proposal is. They have to bring it to the floor in the Turkish parliament, and then there's politics involved there too, but also in Hungary. And the same is happening in terms of finding foreign policy approach of Europe in relation to Ukraine. It's blocked by it. So, and this is part of a major problem of the setup of EU foreign politics, where one state or a coalition of two can block decisions. Not just Orban is doing this. So this is a general structural problem of foreign policy, which also very liberal actors do, because they say on this foreign policy issue, we want something else than you, and we veto it. And then you arrive at some low common denominator.
Regarding these questions, one question now by me that has arisen because of the students' questions related to Ukraine. I have heard recently an idea, I don't know if it's sponsored by Russia or by the US or by Germany, talking about a future accession of Ukraine to the EU, but that Ukraine would be divided. That the parts that are currently controlled by Russia would also join the EU. Do you think this would be possible? Like a divided Ukraine would join the EU together, divided politically internally, but joined similar to what happened in Ireland, with Northern Ireland being part of the single market. Do you think that would be an option?
It's very interesting that you mentioned the example of Northern Ireland. It's very different on many levels, but let's take some elements where you can make a comparison. Yes, I think all these scenarios are very important, because you also have to think of how to negotiate all this on an international level. And we have talked about some of these aspects. So, but I just talk about now the theoretical possibility of the scenario you're describing. Certainly it's possible, but theoretically it's possible. In terms of the European Union saying this is the acquis communautaire, this is our understanding of Ukraine. We don't accept the Russian occupation. So all of Ukraine joins, and then we find some arrangement. How effective and will this be on the ground? We don't know. But I want to talk about something else, and this is the effect that this is going to have. One example you're citing is Northern Ireland, where the effect of the European Union was pacifying. So the integration of whole of Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement was not just an agreement between the communities in Northern Ireland and between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom, but also had a European dimension. And this had a very pacifying impact on the situation in Northern Ireland. A more negative example is Cyprus, where there was also a debate of reuniting the island, both communities, the Greek and the Turkish Cypriot communities, in a political constitutional framework in the early 2000s, sponsored by Kofi Annan, the Annan Plan. The Turkish side accepted the Annan Plan, and the Greeks rejected it, but still Cyprus joined the European Union. And technically now, technically speaking, the whole of Cyprus is part of the European Union. But the acquis communautaire doesn't extend to the north. But technically speaking, Northern Cypriots, the question is if they are from Turkey, mainland Turkey, or from Cyprus, they are EU citizens. But definitely what I want to say is that here is a case where the accession of Cyprus to the European Union, which technically relates to the whole of the island, didn't have a pacifying effect. It didn't lead to escalation in terms of violence. There are a few episodes, but the situation there is stable in terms of violence, no escalation. But politically, it's more difficult than ever to arrive at a solution to the Cyprus question. And this tells you it's not a perfect formula. And this is the context of the debate that we should have with Ukraine. So the answer is yes, this is theoretically possible to think like that, but the effect on peace is not so clear.
Nicole asks again about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And she says that it's a long-lasting conflict, as you mentioned before. I think you are also a specialist in this conflict. My question would be related to this. How's the current situation in Israel regarding the war? Are all Israeli citizens in agreement about the current way the war is going, or is there internal conflict in the country?
There's a lot of internal conflict in Israel, so I don't want to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict now or about the issue between Israel and Hamas. I want to talk about this specific question. The domestic situation in Israel. Israel is very divided. Traditionally, it has a lot of parties. It's a multi-party system. The parties represent very different segments of society, so that political scientists, comparative politics, they call them tribes because they don't have much overlaps. Jewish, Arab. 20% of Israelis are Arabs. They are not Jews, of Israeli citizens. So they have their own parties. The Jews have the religious and the non-religious. The religious have the Sephardi and Ashkenazi. And so these are the different tribes. There's the issue between Jews coming from Europe and from Middle Eastern countries, the Mizrahim and Ashkenazim in the secular sector, not just the religious one. So Israel traditionally is divided. It's even more divided in recent years because Prime Minister Netanyahu is the leading political figure in Israel for the last 30 years and is prime minister with a short interruption since 2009. Is a very divisive figure in Israeli politics. He polarizes the political space in Israel in two camps. And one are people who oppose him immensely, and they have protested against Netanyahu and hate him, actually, consider him evil for a long, long time. But on the other hand, Netanyahu has a camp in which he is the completely accepted leader of this camp. And people have a cult-like positive relationship to him in his Likud party and others. So he's a real star as well in his camp. And this has led over time to a very, very polarized Israeli political system in which more and more conflicts centered around Netanyahu. So those trying to get rid of him and those believing in him. This has increased before Hamas's attack, because the government now, which is very right-wing, not just in relation to the Palestinians, but also domestically, they're doing the Kaczynski Orban thing of transforming the legal system And critics have said they want to get rid of separation of powers in Israel. And this has brought more and more Israelis on the streets in demonstrations since spring, and let even people from the political center, who are not these traditional people who oppose Netanyahu, aligning with people more on the center left. So Israel has become much more polarized, extremely polarized. And then the Hamas attack happened. For a few weeks, Israel was very united, and it still is, that Hamas is an existential threat to Israel. I think this is the majority opinion in Israel, and that the Israeli army is justified in getting rid of this threat, and that this has to be done in a military way. And this also shared by many Arab Israelis, interestingly, seeing Hamas as this existential threat. So this unites Israelis. But Netanyahu was under immense pressure from Israeli society, not from his government. They didn't want to have the hostage issue reaching center stage. But this hostage issue, these hostages held by Hamas, has become the prime issue in the domestic debate in Israel in recent weeks. And this completely came out from societal actors. They organized in groups, they brought this to the agenda, and Netanyahu first wanted to keep this away. He wanted to have this all-out war against Hamas. And so that's a huge debate in Israel. And the position of Netanyahu is very important here. His popularity figures, which always reflected this polarization. He was very much opposed by some, but very much praised and hailed by others. This completely deteriorated. I think his latest approval figures were at 4%. 4%. So most Israelis see him, at least for the time being, as being also responsible for this, what happened with Hamas, because they say that Netanyahu neglected the grave security situation in the Gaza Strip. He nourished Hamas for political reasons in order to weaken the Palestinian Authority. And also, he wanted to have this legal transformation of Israel in order to avoid a corruption process against himself. And by that, he weakened the security apparatus, because many of the pilots and the people in the reserve, they were part of this protest movement. And people in Israel remember this, and I think this explains the low popularity figures.
Do you think about the timing of this conflict? Do you think that initially the conflict was useful for Netanyahu to improve his domestic political position?
No, not to this extent, because it's a big difference between what happened now and the previous rounds of fighting between Hamas and Israel. And I think in this, Netanyahu had a strong interest. Not what happened now, because this had a genocidal character, what Hamas did there. And ultimately, I think it will be very difficult for Netanyahu not to resign at some point, or being forced to resign. Because after such a neglect of the security situation, he tries to put the blame on the security apparatus. But I'm not sure this time if he succeeds. People in Israel say he's like a magician. He always has a rabbit in his head. So maybe he can get one out here too, but I'm not so sure about this. This completely got out of hand, the scale of Hamas's attack. Of course, Netanyahu tried, and Israelis united in saying that a very strong and forceful and uncompromising military response against Hamas is required. And many people felt anger and vengeance in Israel. This is also true. But not to this extent. So it's important to note, as an answer to this question, that Hamas came to power in the Gaza Strip in 2007. After an intra-Palestinian civil war, they consolidated power in the Gaza Strip. And they had different rounds of fighting with Israel, in particular under Netanyahu. And Netanyahu once said in the Central Committee of his party, this was in 2019, he made this statement. I think he regrets now very much that this was recorded back then. He said it's in the interest of us that Hamas's rule over the Gaza Strip is ensured. Because this weakens the Palestinian internally, and we can always say the Palestinians are divided, they're radical, and there will never be a two-state solution. That was Netanyahu's thinking. And his idea was, we can manage this because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be managed by us. Occupation in the West Bank and letting Hamas arm itself. They are more radical. They are not like the Palestinian Authority. They have their fighters. They want to fight, show the strength of their rockets, and they will attack us from time to time, and then we respond, not too forcefully. Of course, the world opinion in some quarters will say Israel genocide, but in effect, these were limited military attacks by Israel against Hamas, and Hamas always knew we will remain in power. There will be airstrikes by Israel, no land incursion, and we will govern the Gaza Strip after this military campaign. And in Israeli military strategy, this was called mowing of the grass. So let the grass of Hamas grow for some time and then mowing it. And this was the equation. And I think Netanyahu immensely failed in this calculation.
Yeah, I've got a question related to a keyword that you just mentioned. You mentioned the two-state solution. Do you think, I have two questions. Do you think a two-state solution is viable given the geographical separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank territories? And the second question is, what do you think about other solution that is floating in the air about the idea of integrating Palestine in the state of Israel? Because you mentioned that 20% of Israeli voters are now Arabs, but there are many Palestinians who are living in Israel who don't have voting rights. Do you think there would be a possibility for those Palestinians to gain Israeli citizenship, and that this would change the political landscape and facilitate a peace settlement?
You sketched two scenarios. The first one was the two-state solution and its viability. And the second one was what some people call the one-state solution. The two-state solution. From my perspective, the two-state solution is the best scenario because it responds to the claim of national self-determination both parties have. We don't get rid of this. This is the political identity of most Israelis and Palestinians. They don't want to live in one state with each other. They have a century of fight, diplomatic, political, military for national self-determination. Also because I think it's the more peaceful solution. If it is an agreed two-state solution in the right parameters, better than the Oslo process. If this is done the right way, I think a two-state solution is the more stable construction that we can have for peaceful relations between Israelis and Palestinians and for the region. It has to be the end of claims against the other side. They have to agree on this. It has to be embedded in a regional context, which I think is much better now than 30 years ago because Saudi Arabia is much more open and others. And we have to find arrangements between these two states because the reality on the ground is that Israel and Palestine are so close to each other that they have to cooperate on many levels. So a kind of federal or transnational dimension. And then it's possible that the Gaza Strip is disconnected from the West Bank. And if you think about it, we just don't think about this in relation to other territories. I have my globe here, but think of Alaska and the United States. The presence of Canada is not a problem. We even don't think about this in these terms because there's no history of conflict between Canada and the United States, but it's working. And you mentioned Northern Ireland. There's a sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So that is definitely possible, but it has to be embedded in a political process. And I can tell you that in the Oslo years, various scenarios have been developed of how this can function well. That we have the Gaza Strip with an airport and a naval port and the West Bank. If this works, it can work very well. Of course, it's demanding. The second question is on the one-state solution. I'm very skeptical about this because Israel defines itself as a Jewish and democratic state. And changing this equation, I think, would be very dangerous in terms of endless escalations of violence between the different groups. The 20%, so in the Israeli territory, I don't talk about the occupied territories. The Arabs who live there are all Israeli citizens, all of them. The issue you mention is related to, of course, the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. If they would become, it's possible theoretically that they become Israeli citizens, then there would be 50% Jews and 50% Arabs in this large state. And I think it would be very difficult to develop a constitutional foundation for this state. Power sharing between these two groups. Of course, it's possible. You have it in I don't know, in Belgium and other places. But we see in Cyprus, for example, how difficult that is. So I don't think it's a good recipe, and it's also a very dangerous one because it can also entrench these conflicts basically forever. One issue is that what is related to East Jerusalem, which is an interesting case because it's Palestinian Arab. A lot of Jewish Israelis live there. These are settlements under international law because East Jerusalem is occupied territory under international law. And that explains that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, although they have the option of becoming Israeli citizens, many of them haven't done this. The Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank cannot become Israeli citizens because these are occupied territories. And they're also seen by Israel as occupied territories. Israel has, in contrast to the West Bank, annexed East Jerusalem to Israel unilaterally. This is not accepted in international law. But this means that from an Israeli legal perspective, East Jerusalem is part of Israel, and the people living there can become Israeli citizens. And most Palestinians there historically have rejected this because they say we live under occupation and we don't accept the citizenship of Israel. And this is a big disadvantage to many of them for various reasons, not having the citizenship, but they say, no, we don't want to have it. It has changed a bit in recent years, more, but it's still a fragment of Palestinians from East Jerusalem who have demanded an Israeli passport.
George Rechenyuk has asked about Ukraine. He asked about how do you assess Putin's success in Ukraine if you consider the current result as a win or as a loss for Putin himself?
It's not yet settled. We have to see. It's very dynamic, as all wars. Wars are very difficult to make a forecast. How is this going to play out? I think it's a balance sheet. At some levels, I think Putin has succeeded. He has consolidated his authoritarian grip in Russian politics. He has brought the issue of global alliance building to the global level. So he has started a conflict with the United States, the West, not massively, not in a complete direct escalation, but he has made this step. So in that sense, he has also, that's part of his foreign policy thinking, as we have learned after February 2022, how he interprets Bucharest, the idea of NATO enlargement and all these issues, even the 1990s NATO enlargement and maybe Georgia and Ukraine. So from that perspective, it's open. He interferes in European countries and societies. So from that perspective, he has succeeded, but he's under immense pressure. And I think we have to focus a lot on this. So that he's demanding a lot from Russian society. I said before that 300,000 Russians are, that's what the British say. I cannot prove these figures, but that 3,000 Russian soldiers have died, and the toll is immensely on Russia, also economically, also diplomatically. And if you think of what I just said, Russia is excluded from peacemaking in the Middle East now. This is the affair of the United States, of Qatar, of Saudi Arabia. And in a different world, I think Russia would be very essential to everything that is going on in the Middle East right now. But they are not, so I think they are isolated. And what this leads to is that they are still very strong. They have a strong army. They can recruit people in Russia very easily as long as Russians are not able to protest. They don't ask people in Moscow and Petersburg to go to the front lines. So they can keep this status quo, I think, and then they put a lot of effort in this, of keeping the status quo. Becoming more offensive in a military way, or even diplomatically, I think they are really restricted right now. And this is gonna stay like this as long as China doesn't make a very clear decision to fully back Russia. And they haven't done this yet. They completely support Russia. They're not opposing Russia, but China is trying to keep this balance. And as long as this is happening, I think this is not going to change. And so you can see from what I'm saying, I think it's still open, but I think we exaggerate if we say that's a success now for Russia, what is going on there. I think it's a big disaster for world politics, also for us as EU, as Europeans. It's not what we envisaged, and it's difficult for us on many levels too, but it's a big problem for Russia. I believe this.
Okay, so I have one question of mine related to the Middle East, and but also related to the war in Ukraine, and it's the role of Turkey, right? What do you think about the role Turkey is playing? First, it's a member of NATO on the one hand, but on the other hand, it has been helping make deals with Russia for grain exports and for other issues related to the war. They at some point they also bought anti-air missile systems from Russia, right? But now in the conflict with Israel, they are also being Erdogan is being very vocal about the conflict of Palestine, and has recently visited Germany too, where I believe there's also a very big, very large Turkish population in Germany. What do you think about Turkey's role? Now it's offering to create campaign hospitals in the Gaza Strip. It's becoming now a major player in world politics, or not, or if it's just for show. What do you think?
No, I think it's a rising. The Ottoman Empire was very powerful, so rising power in terms of Turkey. But it's a transformation of world politics, and Turkey is a very important state. We see this particularly in Ukraine and the Middle East because it's located right in the middle. And Turkish foreign policy has changed very much from being more inward-looking to being outward-looking, and having geopolitical ambitions. And also some ideological ones. So I think this comes up when Erdogan, he's nationalist, but I think this defines also other parties in Turkey. So this very nationalist discourse is, I think, widely shared in many segments of the Turkish political elite. Goes back to also the Kemalist, and of course he comes from a different branch. He has this religious pan-Islam agenda as well, which he has emphasized more strongly a decade ago than today. So Turkey tries to maintain this role of an independent state with geopolitical interests, and they are playing this out, a broker. And I think on many levels they have been playing this very professionally. The grain deals with Ukraine is one example, also maintaining different channels of communication with Putin, also with Hamas. So that is what the perception with Erdogan and Turkish foreign policy is. They are to some extent a buffer state, and I think this makes it difficult because then you can ask the question: will they shift one day, maybe to another side? But they are part of NATO, and this keeps them security-wise. And they want F-16 fighter jets now from the United States and all this. But politically, they are a buffer state, and they play this role. And as I said before, always with buffer states, they can be a nuisance as well. It can be very positive with the grain deal that was helpful on other levels. It can be also disturbing. I think they are not in the center of the debate now on the Gaza issue. This is more the United States, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. So they haven't succeeded to the same extent of getting their foot in there. And if I may say this, I also don't have proof for this, but I think part of the big protest by Erdogan directed against Israel, and he has a history with Israel and with Netanyahu and the Gaza Strip issue, and so there's an ideological dimension to what he's saying, addressing pan-Islam audience, a leader of the Muslim world and stuff like this. But I also think that some of his angry reaction was geopolitical. Why? Because the United States has sent 2 aircraft carriers into the Eastern Mediterranean. One of them is now in the Gulf. But the Eastern Mediterranean, if you look at what is happening there in the last 10 years with finding natural gas, the Cyprus issue, everything very important to Turkey, and the Americans actually said we somehow leave the Middle East. The United States got not involved in Syria. That's what Russia did, and Turkey. So his idea was, I think, that the Eastern Mediterranean, that Turkey has the largest potential for projecting power in the Eastern Mediterranean. And now the Americans come with 2 aircraft carriers. And I think that's also part of his anger, is that something in the Eastern Mediterranean security arrangement is about to change. And he didn't like this, maybe even long term. So it's not just related to Gaza and the plight of people there, and maybe some geopolitical consideration of linkages to Muslim majority countries, but also this geopolitical issue related to the Eastern Mediterranean space.
Look, Stephan, we've got many more questions, but I realize it will be impossible to answer all those questions today. So my question for you is, seeing that we have so many students that would like to learn from you, how many students of ours could you accept as Erasmus students at your university so that they continue asking you these questions over there?
I could accept as many as possible. I suggest that you write to me and I put you in touch with our international office, because they arrange these agreements, and maybe we've also find the time to meet in Munich and Jasche and sign it. And I think we can do it. If there's interest from your students, that would be very positive. We are very happy here welcoming international students, and suggest you write to me. I put you in touch with our international office, and we can see and define such a framework.
Yes, I think the good thing between Jasche and Munich is that there's a very good flight connection. I just checked before your lecture today, and it was 150 euros for a return flight from Jasche to Munich, which is very, very convenient. And it's only three hours with one stop in Vienna. And it's, yes, I think it's an opportunity that we should see. I'm happy that this has been a success, and that so many students have been interested in writing. You see, many of them are still writing now, asking about many different areas of the world, about Armenia, Azerbaijan, and I understand it's difficult, as you mentioned, to discuss about all the different regions of the world, because each person has his or her own area of specialization, right? But what I would highlight is this great interest that your lecture today has had among our students. I think it was a good result. What do you think about this first participation of yours in one of the Eurosci network live streams?
I loved it. It looks like CNN. The screen I see in front of me looks like a CNN broadcast.
Well,
it's format that I would like to extend this to the students and to you, Diego, for asking these questions. And of course, I was invited to speak here, so I had longer or shorter interventions, but I had the time to elaborate on ideas. But I hope it wasn't a monologue. And I think it wasn't, because you had the possibility to ask questions. And I think this is a very good format, because these questions are very informed, and they allow actually to address different angles and to then go a bit deeper, and then the next aspect. And I think we have touched on many of the important aspects of this global international politics debate.
Yes, but I have reserved the best question for the last one. Yes, okay. Because this is the question that most of our students, the University of Iași is very close to the border with the Republic of Moldova, right? It's the external border of the EU, but Moldova is considered in fact, Iași is part of Moldova, right? Or part of the historical region of Moldova.
Yeah.
And what are your prospects for the future of Moldova?
Romania has a history with two principalities. So you mentioned just that we should see Romania, Moldova also in these terms. I think the same as I said before about Southeast Europe and Ukraine. The membership perspective is extremely important. I would see it moving on much faster. I think Europe could also do this, but we said this, they are divided internally, so that's very difficult for Europe to move fast in institutional terms, but that's a problem and concern. My reading of Moldova is that they were very afraid when this war started, of course, they're seen very much in a package with the by the European Union, I think, with Ukraine. But I would encourage Romania to push for individual awareness of Moldova in the foreign policy debate in Brussels. That's what I would suggest here, and I think it also belongs into the European Union, and then a long-term process with Russia has to start. That it's about self-determination, because I think that most Moldovans want to be part of the European Union, and then I think they also have a right to do this. So that's the perspective I see here.
Thank you very much, Stephan Stetter, Professor of International Politics and Conflict Research at the Bundeswehr University in Munich. Thank you very much for being with us today, and you are welcome anytime you want to come back. Thank you.
It was a big pleasure. Have a nice day, everybody there.